history in its truest form is rarely written in ink. It is written in blood, on the pavement of forgotten streets, in the silence of smoke-filled rooms, and in the unspoken agreements between dangerous men. When we look back at the history of organized crime in America, we often look to the Italians, the Lucianos, the Genoveses, the Capones. We look at the sprawling empires built on prohibition liquor and political corruption. But there is a chapter that often goes unspoken, a week in the autumn of 1935 that fundamentally altered the geography of New York's underworld. It was a week where the established order of white supremacy in the criminal world was not just challenged, but systematically dismantled by a man who understood that true power does not roar, it whispers. This is the story of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Arthur Dutch Schultz, and the 7 days that turned Harlem into a graveyard for the arrogant. To understand the violence that was to come, one must first understand the stage upon which it was played. 1935. The Great Depression had its iron grip on New York City. The Roaring Twenties were a distant memory, replaced by breadlines, despair, and a suffocating gray fog of poverty. But uptown, past 110th Street, in the beating heart of Black America, there was a different kind of economy at work. Harlem. To the outsider, Harlem was a place of exotic nightlife, where the Cotton Club and the Savoy offered white downtoners a taste of jazz and gin. But beneath the rhythm of Duke Ellington and the tap shoes of Bill Robinson, Harlem was fighting for its survival. And the lifeblood of that survival was the numbers. The policy game, a penny ante lottery where a nickel could turn into $5, enough to pay rent, buy groceries, or keep the lights on for another week. It was illegal, yes, but in a community denied loans by white banks and jobs by white corporations, the numbers game was the unofficial banking system of Harlem. It was an economy worth millions. And where there are millions, there are predators. The collision of kings. Enter Arthur Flegenheimer, known to the world and the police blotters as Dutch Schultz. By 1935, Schultz was a man cornered, once the beer baron of the Bronx, a man whose bootlegging empire rivaled Al Capone's. Schultz was now watching his kingdom crumble. The repeal of prohibition had dried up the easy money. The federal government, led by Thomas Dewey, was hunting him with relentless precision. And perhaps most dangerously, his fellow mobsters, the newly formed commission, viewed him as a liability. Schultz was volatile, he was cheap, he was prone to fits of murderous rage that frightened even his own hitmen. He dressed in cheap suits, wore frayed shirts, and killed with the impulsiveness of a cornered animal. Desperate for cash to pay his legal fees and maintain his lifestyle, Schultz looked at Harlem and saw a goldmine that he believed was unguarded. He saw the black numbers bankers, Madame St. Clair Casper Holstein, as weak. He believed that the color of his skin and the caliber of his Tommy guns gave him the divine right to conquer. He moved into Harlem with blunt force, beating runners, intimidating bankers, and demanding a cut of every dime that moved through the neighborhood. He thought he had won, he thought Harlem had bowed. But he had overlooked one man, a man who was everything Schultz was not. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy. Where Schultz was manic, Johnson was meditative. Where Schultz was a thug who rose to power through brute force, Bumpy Johnson was a strategist who read Nietzsche and history, a chess player who viewed the streets as a board of 64 squares. Bumpy was not merely a gangster, he was a gatekeeper. He had served time in prison, he had educated himself in the library, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect from judges and junkies alike. Schultz saw Bumpy Johnson as just another colored lieutenant to be brought to heel. It was a miscalculation born of racism and arrogance, a miscalculation that would cost him everything. The incident at the Cotton Club. The date was Monday, mid-September 1935. The venue was the legendary Cotton Club. The atmosphere inside was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive perfume. It was a strange paradox, the Cotton Club, a venue in the heart of Harlem that barred black patrons while showcasing black talent. It was the playground of the white elite, the gangsters, and the politicians. Bumpy Johnson sat at a table near the back, nursing a drink, his eyes scanning the room. He was there on business, maintaining the delicate balance of the underworld. He was calm. He was always calm. Dutch Schultz entered the room like a storm front. He was already drunk, his face flushed, his cheap suit rumpled. The stress of the federal investigation and the resistance in Harlem had frayed his nerves. When he spotted Johnson, something in him snapped. Perhaps it was Johnson's suit, which was better tailored than his own. Perhaps it was the way Johnson held his head high, refusing to look down in the presence of a white mob boss. Schultz marched across the floor, his bodyguards trailing behind him. The music didn't stop, but the conversations did. The air in the room shifted. Schultz slammed his hand on Johnson's table. The glass rattled. The words Schultz used that night were ugly. They were the words of a man who believed his race made him superior. He called Johnson a boy. He used slurs that were meant to strip a man of his humanity. He shouted for the entire club to hear, performing for an audience, trying to humiliate the one man in Harlem he couldn't control. "You think you're a big shot," Schultz roared, spittle flying from his mouth. "You're nothing, you work for me. Harlem works for me, and if I want to crush you, I'll crush you like a bug." The entire room held its breath. In 1935, for a black man to even make eye contact with a white aggressor was dangerous. To talk back was a death sentence. Bumpy Johnson did not stand up. He did not reach for the gun tucked under his arm. He simply looked up at Schultz. His eyes were void of fear, void of anger. They were cold, the kind of cold that burns. He waited for Schultz to finish his tirade. He waited until the silence was absolute. And then Bumpy Johnson spoke. His voice was low, a baritone rumble that required people to lean in to hear. "Are you finished, Dutchman?" Schultz blinked, taken aback by the lack of fear. "You have 7 days," Johnson said. 7 days to pull your people out of Harlem, every runner, every collector, every enforcer. If they are still here on day 8, they won't be leaving at all." Schultz laughed. It was a loud, incredulous laugh. He looked around at the crowd, inviting them to share in the joke. A black numbers runner threatening the most powerful gangster in New York. It was absurd. "Or what?" Schultz sneered. "Or," Johnson said, taking a sip of his drink, "I will kill them, one by one, until you understand that Harlem is not yours." Schultz spat on the floor near Johnson's shoes, turned on his heel and walked out, laughing all the way to the door. He treated the threat as the posturing of a powerless man. He went home that night and slept soundly, believing he was untouchable. He did not know that he had just started a clock. The silence before the storm. The next morning, Harlem was eerily quiet. Schultz expected retaliation. He doubled his guards, sent his men out to find Johnson, expecting a drive-by shooting or a clumsy attack on his headquarters. He was prepared for a gang war. But Bumpy Johnson did not fight gang wars. He fought campaigns. Johnson vanished. He dissolved into the brownstones and basements of Harlem. He wasn't hiding in fear. He was moving into position. He gathered a small, tight circle of his most trusted men, men who knew the alleyways and rooftops of the neighborhood better than they knew the lines on their own palms. Johnson's instruction was simple. "We do not touch Schultz, not yet. Schultz is the head of the snake, but a snake can still bite if you cut off the head. We starve the snake. We cut off the body. We show him that his power does not work here." The plan was psychological. It wasn't enough to kill Schultz's men. They had to die in a way that bred terror. They had to die in a way that made working for Dutch Schultz in Harlem seem like a suicide mission. The list was drawn up, 8 names, the key lieutenants who managed Schultz's empire in Uptown. The deadline began. The 7 days of judgment. Day 1, the collector. Vincent the Clutch Mel was a man of routine. He was Schultz's primary bagman for 125th Street, a brutal man who enjoyed breaking the fingers of shopkeepers who were short on their payments. He felt safe. He was white, he was armed, and he worked for the Dutchman. On the first night of the deadline, Mel finished his collections. He was carrying a satchel containing $4,000, a fortune in those days. He walked to his car, whistling, thinking about a warm meal and a warm bed. He never reached the car. He was found the next morning in a garbage bin behind a bakery. The money was untouched. This was the first message. If it had been a robbery, the money would be gone. Leaving the cash said clearly, "This is not about greed. This is about payment." Pinned to his chest with an ice pick was a note, written in careful block letters, one down, 7TOGO, leave Harlem. When the news reached Schultz, he flew into a rage. He broke furniture. He screamed at his subordinates. But underneath the rage, a seed of doubt was planted. The money was left behind. Who leaves $4,000? Day 2, the shadow in the stairwell. Schultz ordered his men to travel in pairs. He sent more guns uptown. "Find Johnson," he screamed. "Burn the neighborhood down if you have to." But Harlem is a labyrinth to those who don't belong. Schultz's men were outsiders. They stuck out. They were watched by 1,000 eyes, from windows, from stoops, from storefronts. Frank Morrison was an enforcer. He was one of the men who had been at the Cotton Club laughing at Johnson. He was assigned to guard a policy bank on Lenox Avenue. He was heavily armed. He was found in the stairwell of his own apartment building. There were no signs of a struggle, no gunshots heard, just a single, clean knife wound to the heart. The efficiency of the kill was terrifying. It meant someone had been waiting. Someone had been watching him for hours, learning his movements, breathing the same air, waiting for the split second he let his guard down. The note was found in his pocket. 2 down, 6 to GO, the clock is ticking. Panic began to ripple through Schultz's organization. These were not street brawls. These were executions. Day 3 and 4, the invisible hand. By the third day, the streets of Harlem felt different. The residents knew something was happening. There was a tension, an electric charge in the air. The police were baffled. They found bodies but no witnesses. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. When detectives questioned the locals, they were met with blank stares. "Bumpy Johnson, haven't seen him in weeks, officer. Dutch Schultz, don't know him." The community was protecting its own. For the first time, the people of Harlem saw a force that was striking back against the predators. On day 3, a Schultz lieutenant was shot from a rooftop while eating lunch in a diner. On day 4, 2 enforcers were found in the trunk of a car parked 3 blocks from the police station. The notes continued, 3 down, 4 down. Schultz was losing control. His men were refusing to go uptown. Drivers were calling in sick. Collectors were quitting. The psychological weight of the countdown was crushing them. It wasn't just the death, it was the inevitability of it. Bumpy Johnson had said 1 a day, and he was delivering 1 a day with the reliability of the sunrise. Schultz tried to negotiate. He sent emissaries to the other families, to the Italians. "Help me crush this rebellion," he pleaded, but Luciano and Lansky watched from the sidelines. They saw Schultz as a liability. They saw Bumpy Johnson as a man of business. They stayed silent, letting the Dutchman bleed. Day 5, the betrayal of confidence. Schultz was now living in a state of paranoia. He barricaded himself in his headquarters in the Bronx. He drank heavily. He stopped sleeping. He sent his toughest man, a giant named Mick O'Connor, to take charge of the Harlem operation. O'Connor was a veteran of the beer wars, a man who had survived a dozen shootouts. He publicly boasted that he would mount Bumpy Johnson's head on a spike. O'Connor lasted 6 hours in Harlem. He was lured into a basement speakeasy by an informant. He thought he was meeting a defector from Johnson's crew. Instead, he walked into a room where Bumpy Johnson was sitting alone at a table, shuffling a deck of cards. We do not know exactly what was said in that room. We only know that O'Connor's body was found the next morning, propped up on a park bench, facing the Bronx, facing Schultz's headquarters. The note was pinned to his lapel. 5 down, 3 to GO, IT have TO end like this. Day 6, the collapse. Schultz's empire in Harlem had effectively ceased to function. The numbers banks were closed. The runners were hiding. The money had stopped flowing. Schultz was hemorrhaging cash. his legal bills were mounting. His protection payments were due, and his revenue stream had been severed by the surgical knife of Bumpy Johnson. On the sixth day, the killing stopped being necessary, but the message had to be finished. Schultz's personal driver, a man who had been with him for years, was found bound and gagged, but alive on the border of 110th Street. He had not been harmed physically, but his spirit was broken. He told police that he had been held for hours in a dark room, where a voice, calm, deep, terrifying, had read him the history of Harlem, had explained the economics of the neighborhood, and had told him exactly how he would die if he ever crossed 110th Street again. He delivered the note to Schultz personally. 6 down, 2 to Go, tomorrow is the last day. The final day. Day 7, the deadline. Dutch Schultz sat in his office, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He was a broken man. Not broken by force of arms, but by the realization that he was outmatched. He had guns, he had money, he had political connections. But he did not have the one thing that Bumpy Johnson possessed: the consent of the people and the discipline of a grandmaster. Schultz waited for the 7th body. He waited for the final blow. But the 7th death never came. Instead, at noon on the 7th day, a courier arrived at the Bronx headquarters. He carried a small, wrapped box. Schultz's bodyguards drew their weapons, fearing a bomb. They opened the box carefully. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a hat, a gray fedora. It was the hat Dutch Schultz had worn to the Cotton Club 7 days earlier. He had left it on the rack in his anger. Beneath the hat was the final note. It did not say 7 down. It read, "The game is over. Harlem is closed. Stay out." It was the ultimate insult. Bumpy Johnson was telling him, "I could have killed you. I could have killed all of them. But I am letting you live with the knowledge that you lost." Schultz stared at the hat. He understood then, in a rare moment of clarity through his alcoholic haze, that he had been defeated. He ordered his remaining men to withdraw. He abandoned his Harlem operations. He walked away from millions of dollars, defeated not by an army, but by one man's will. The aftermath and legacy. The war for Harlem was over. Bumpy Johnson emerged from the shadows not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He reopened the numbers banks. The money began to flow again, but this time it stayed in Harlem. It funded local businesses, it paid for rents, it supported families. Johnson took his cut, certainly. He was a gangster, not a saint, but he ensured that the community was treated with dignity. Dutch Schultz did not survive long after his defeat. The smell of weakness is fatal in the underworld. Seeing him humiliated in Harlem, the commission decided he was finished. On October 23, 1935, barely a month after the deadline expired, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in the bathroom of the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Some say it was Luciano's order, some say it was Lansky, but on the streets of Harlem, the old-timers will tell you a different story. They will tell you that the bullets that killed Dutch Schultz were fired in Newark, but the trigger was pulled weeks earlier, in the Cotton Club, when he made the mistake of disrespecting Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. This story serves as a grim reminder of the unwritten laws of the street. In a world of violence, respect is the only currency that matters. Size doesn't matter. Money doesn't matter. When you strip a man of his dignity, you give him nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous force on earth. Bumpy Johnson reigned over Harlem for another 30 years. He went to Alcatraz, he came back, and he held his throne until the day he died of a heart attack in 1968, eating fried chicken at Wells Restaurant. But it was those 7 days in 1935 that forged the legend. 7 days where the chessboard was reset. 7 days where David didn't just defeat Goliath, he evicted him.